Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Lash Extension Podcast. I'm Erin.
And I'm Tress. And today we are talking about how to raise your prices without losing any clients. And this is something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and I'm really, really happy to bring to you today because Erin and I both have a lot of experience here. And not only do we have a lot of experience in it ourselves, but we have a lot of experience working with our students and our own clients and helping other people raise their prices too. So we have a little bit of an agenda today because we want to go over some really important aspects of this before we get to how to actually raise your prices without losing any clients.
We really want this episode to be something that you guys can implement and apply immediately. So we are giving you a how-to, a step-by-step today on things that you can immediately implement in your business if you are needing to raise your prices and if you are able to currently raise your prices. And these are also things that we're going to cover in today's episode.
Yeah, we're going to help you learn if now is the time or when is the time if it's not right now. And honestly, I know most of us would like to believe that now is always the time to raise our prices, whether we are intimidated by it or flat out scared of it or excited by it. Now is not always the time to raise our prices. There is a time and a place.
Tea.
So we are in a very unique time in the industry right now. And I know that we are seeing some major shifts happening between 2023 and 2024. And I think 2024 is going to be an incredible year as far as innovation goes. I think it's going to be an incredible year as far as personal growth and development goes. And I think that we are going to see some shifts and changes in the industry that are necessary, but maybe don't feel as good as we want them to. And so if we can anticipate them and understand what's going on around us, I think it's going to help that transition be easier and it's going to help us continue to grow through the year. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's get into it.
Okay.
Raising your effing prices.
Whoa.
Dun, dun, dun.
Okay, well, first, let's talk about the state our industry is in right now. Because we are kind of in a little fairy tale bubble right now. We have somehow managed to, as is probably obvious, Erin and I are in the US. So if you are joining us from another country, thank you for being here. We love you. Thank you. But in the US, we're in a little bit of a fantasy bubble. And that's because we developed really quickly, like the lash industry grew really, really quickly. And we all decided that we were worth a whole hell of a lot. And I think that that is absolutely beautiful, but we're in a different state than the other countries around the world really are.
It's so different how each country in the each country's lash industry is just so different.
Yeah, it really is.
Price point, types of lashes, different trends, product availability. There's so much difference between each country.
Yeah. So what we're seeing now is people are bringing up like the differences between how much lash artists in one country earn on a full set or a fill versus how much people in the US earn. And what's happening in the US right now is while there are always new lash artists joining the fray, we are seeing lash artists in general raise their prices on like a yearly basis and raise them significantly.
Or many times a year.
Or multiple times a year, yes. And there is a lot of advice that's gone on out there, and I've given some of it that I absolutely still stand by. And we're going to talk about that. But there's a lot of advice that's given out there around pricing, and it's really important that you find the advice that works well for you in your particular circumstance, in your particular area, in your particular place in your career.
This is not a one-size-fits-all conversation or topic.
Not by any means. And so what we're watching right now is we're watching lash artists, whether proficient or elite, raise their prices year upon year upon year. and we're starting to price ourselves out, in my opinion. The fact that lash extension prices are around, like, in really good for great artists that are in good areas, that are around 300, 350, hitting 400. My question for you is, how long do you think we can keep raising these prices as steeply as we have been and still have clients? Because I know my nail artist doesn't raise her prices by $10 a year. And if she did, I wouldn't be able to keep going back nearly as frequently as I would like to. If my hairstylist raised her prices $10 or $15 or $20 a year, which we are seeing some lash artists do, good for them if they can do it and they're keeping their clientele full. But this is something that I feel like we're going to hit the ceiling. We're going to hit the glass ceiling, and we're going to see some major shifts happening, because as the economy changes, as inflation grows, as people are experiencing life in a different way, we're not going to be able to keep charging more and more and more and more and expect people to pay it.
So do you think that this is attributed to the age of our industry compared to like the hair industry, for example? Like they have really found more of that groove because simply they have a longer standing industry with much more trial and error, if you will, that now they have found the flow that keeps them moving forward as an industry. As where the lash industry is still a very new industry, relatively speaking. We're evolving extremely quickly with both products and what's working best and education and knowledge, and prices have been following that.
I also think yes, it's with the newness of our industry, but I think it's what's being taught out there. We've brought it up before, but like hustle culture and, boss mentality and everybody wanting to be their own business owner. I think that what's being taught is that you can make as much money as you want. And I think that is applicable to an extent. But I think when I say we're going to hit our glass ceiling, what I mean is we're going to get to the point where we can very likely, just a prediction, but very likely only then start to raise our prices year by year based on inflation and based on cost of living, not based on I deserve more because I took a class. And we're going to get to that in a little bit.
We're going to talk about it. So let's get into that.
So here's my thing. We've been talking a lot about how much lash artists raise their prices, and it is almost unheard of to hear of a lash artist only raising their prices by $5. I know that back in the day, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, hairstylists or service providers in the beauty industry would raise their prices $2 or $3.
Yeah.
And sometimes clients wouldn't keep coming back.
Oh, I remember back in like 2017, 18, when I was considering a price raise, I was like, should I just do it $3? $5 seems too much. Should I just do a $3 price raise?
So let's get some clarification here, or some comparison to another industry. Not even another industry, just like corporate America. In corporate America, an average raise is about 4.4% in 2023. In 2022, it was about 6%.
Okay.
If you are going from one company to another and working on getting a promotion, then it would be about a 10%, maybe up to a 20% raise, depending on how great you are at your job. Okay. So if we just very, very loosely average it out, if a lash artist raises their price $10 per service, so like $10 a fill, that is anywhere from double to triple a yearly corporate raise. So we are raising our prices significantly faster than the rest of the world around us, at least in the US, is making more money. So that's why I feel like we're going to kind of tap out, because the rest of the world isn't keeping up with how quickly we're raising our prices. They're not making enough money to cover that disparity. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So when we're thinking about raising our prices, $10 seems like a lot when we're putting ourselves in our client's place, but it's not a lot when you think about the average advice that lash artists are getting on how to raise their prices.
And the frequency that we're seeing this talked about. And I think that I probably see a reel or at least one reel per day of people talking about raise your prices, how to raise your prices, what you should be charging, $100K a year as a lash artist, and all of that marketing that's going into that, and what you can actually make as a lash artist, and XYZ. We know all of those marketing one-liners at this point. It's being talked about so frequently that if you think about the ratio at which we are consuming that knowledge, it feels like our pace and our mind speeds up, so that, oh, I've seen this now 100 times over the last 6 months, maybe more. I feel pressure to raise my prices now, because it's the same thing as like sales mentality. If, they see your post 7 to 14 times, whatever the average is, before they actually buy from you, similar mentality that's happening with this, only it's just a vast conversation that's happening on social media so often. So we're hearing this so frequently that now lash artists are feeling constant pressure to be raising their prices. And not only that they should be raising their prices, but how much to be raising their prices by at any given time. I've heard many different advices on this over my years in the industry. I've heard, you shouldn't raise your prices more than $5 at a time. Or I've also heard $5 is way too low. You should never raise your prices less than $15 per appointment every single year. Then I've heard you should raise your prices by no less than 20% and above in order to intentionally lose clients. And then I've heard it where you should raise your prices only when you are fully booked, and overbooked is when you should raise your prices. There is so much conflicting information out there that even I'm confused.
We can make it easy today though.
I was even confused. I was like, hello, what do I do at this point? Because there are a lot of really big influential people that are explaining it in so many different ways that even I was confused.
Yeah.
And I had to shut all of that out, and I had to think about my demographic, my clientele, and what felt right to me in my business.
Right. I've encountered so many lash artists recently, and to be fair, at every mega volume training I did, we had a discussion about raising prices. It was part of the program. It was part of us helping our students as best as we possibly could. And we had that conversation at every class. But I did not indiscriminately go across the board and say, hey, everybody has to raise their prices. And that was what was important. Like, that's why we spent time with everybody individually. And if we weren't raising prices, we were setting goals for what that would look like and when the circumstances would be right for that. And I think that that's the important part here. So there is.
And also, really quickly, I just want to say, we're not talking poorly about raising prices. We definitely think that you should raise your prices. We're not saying that, like, we're not demonizing the lash industry here.
I raised my prices 5 times in 4 years.
Right. I've done every single year except for this last year have I raised my prices since I've been in the lash industry. Like, same here. So I want to just like give that disclaimer here. We're not villainizing raising your prices. We think that you should. We just think that there is a strategic way to go about this that's actually helpful for your business rather than potentially harmful in the future.
Exactly. So one of the things that I had so many conversations about was I would sit down and I would go, okay, let's talk about your prices if you want to. What is your average fill at? And it's so surprising because it went from students looking at me years ago going, okay, this is what I charge. And me going, oh, sister, we can do better. Let's do better for you. To lash artists looking at me and going, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. Like, I'm so embarrassed that you're going to see this. I know I need to raise them. And then they would tell me that they do $85 and $95 fills. And I was like, what is happening here?
Such a quick pace difference
Within a few years. And so I wonder why our culture got to the point that we're embarrassed that we earn such a good living.
I think the lash industry is one of the best that you can be in.
It is. It's beautiful.
I love this industry. I would choose it 1,000,000 times over again.
And I can't believe that, like, okay, so when I started doing esthetician work, the average price that you wanted to charge per hour was about $60 an hour. You knew that you were like making good money and at a good spot in your career if you could charge $60 an hour. So if you had longer services, obviously if it was an hour and a half, you were charging $90 for a service. But that was that. Now we're looking at about $100 an hour. Everybody wants about $100 an hour. And that is, even after expenses, such an incredible wage.
It is.
Even if expenses are 40% or 50% of what you do, like when all is said and done, and I mean everything accounted for.
Overhead, taxes, personal bill, yeah.
Earning $50 an hour? Like, I never could have imagined going into an industry where like free and clear $50 an hour after everything, right? And I know that not everybody's at that point, but that's the point that it can get to, even if you're not there yet. And some people are definitely beyond that. But I think it's such a beautiful thing to sit back and go, wait, I went to beauty school. I earn a really, really good living doing this. I'm very likely doing something that I love, and I get to serve people and make a difference in people's lives as I do it. And for most of us, it means a whole heck of a lot that we're not sitting behind a desk somewhere in a cubicle or stocking shelves or checking people out. Not that any of those are bad things, but I know lash artists have very specific brains and very specific desires. And if we can just take a moment to appreciate how far we've come in this industry and what we can get paid for what is technically a trade and just in quotes, just a skill, I think we can continue to have this conversation in a way that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and that takes the pressure off of lash artists feeling like we have to keep chasing this like magic ceiling, this magic number.
So what constitutes a price raise? Between you and me, we believe pretty strongly that there are certain things that constitute raising your prices, and there are very much certain things that don't. And if
these might surprise you,
and
these might be a little bit controversial.
They might push some buttons, so stick around for that. and still, at the end, after we get through these things, we are going to teach you the verbiage and the step-by-step way to raise your prices without losing any clients. So, what constitutes a price raise? The first on our list is inflation.
Inflation, like. We're talking about general inflation here. We're talking about the price of groceries. We're talking about the price of cleaning supplies. We're talking about overall the inflation and price of goods that increases annually based on the economy. This happens with everything. So our overhead as lash artists continue to increase. Our studio, if you are in a commercial lease, typically will have a 3 to 5% increase every year because that is the typical annual inflation rate for at least the United States. I can't speak for other countries, but that's the typical percentage per year that we see an increase in both goods and in services.
So I just looked it up. And average consumer price inflation should be about 2.8% in 2024. So that means if you're raising your prices, again, this is averaged out, $10 for every fill. That is anywhere from 4 to 6 times higher than the average inflation rate, just so that we like keep our wits about us here.
Just so we have reference points here.
Yeah.
So inflation is the first thing that we believe constitutes a price raise. Because when our overhead increases, our prices of services will increase with it in order to maintain our overhead. We are in business here. We should be making money in our business. That's the goal. So that constitutes a price raise. The second thing is kind of in the same vein, living expenses and wage. So living expenses, depending on where you're at, continue to go up every year, including general economic inflation. So living expenses, your rent at home every month, electric bills, gas, et cetera, et cetera. You can go down the list. So living expenses and wages.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that constitutes a price raise, that's kind of funny. Maybe it is a price rage. And maybe this constitutes it, but that has to be taken into consideration for it, is the area that you live in and the demographic around you. And I can't even tell you how much it is important to take that into consideration.
Yes.
And the thing is, there is always going to be basic and there's always going to be elite, right? So there's always going to be hair shops that you can walk into that you can get a really inexpensive haircut. You have no idea how it's going to turn out, but you can get a really inexpensive haircut. And there's always going to be incredibly specialized high-end salons and spas where you can get your hair done for anywhere from $300 to $800 to multiple thousands of dollars. Okay. So I think it's important to point this out, that there is a huge spectrum, and there is a spectrum within each demographic as well.
Yes.
But I can tell you, growing up in Farmington, Minnesota, they're not going to have as high of a spectrum of a possibility as living in Los Angeles.
Well, yeah, my original hometown is 20 minutes down the road from Salem, where my current businesses are, and even 20 minutes down the road, I could not charge what I can charge in the city that I'm currently in.
Right.
Like, the demographic plays such a huge part in your ceiling and what you're able to charge, and the demand of clientele in that area looking for lash extensions or not. I oftentimes, when this conversation comes up, that is a lot of the struggle of lash artists, that they're working in a small town, that their clientele doesn't want more than classic lashes potentially, and they're already the highest priced in the area. What do I do?
So I think it's beautiful to be the highest priced in your area.
Yeah.
So I moved a little bit closer to the city when I was in Minnesota. I moved a little closer to Minneapolis and St. Paul, and I was able to charge more there. And I was able to not incrementally, I made leaps and bounds. I raised my prices a lot, right? But I raised them as I grew and as my clientele grew. So I very quickly, I would say within 4 to 5 years, which nobody feels like is fast these days, but it was pretty quickly to go from $100 full set to a $300 full set.
Yeah.
In Minnesota 8 years ago. That was huge. I didn't know anybody else in my area that was charging that much. I didn't feel guilty about it. Because I was also the only one in my area who could produce the kind of lashes that I could produce with the retention that I could produce.
Yep.
So that's where I believe, even if you are in a smaller town and you are the highest priced, it doesn't mean that you can't raise your prices. Yep. It means that you need to be able to have the confidence to do it. You need to be able to stand behind it. And I would not personally suggest doing it without having a full clientele first. But you also need to be giving extraordinary service, because if you keep raising your prices year after year and you don't level up your service and your client experience with it, eventually those clients are going to start dropping like flies, because they're going to realize they can in fact get lashes somewhere else, even if they like you a whole lot.
Yep.
So,
and the other key thing here that I'm taking it back to discernment here, and which advice is that you take. larger cities versus smaller cities is going to be a difference in what method and strategy works for you. I think it goes to say, and it's worth saying, that it is much easier to raise your prices to higher levels potentially in larger cities oftentimes than tiny, tiny cities.
Yeah, I agree. And we don't want to have to agree with that. We want to be like, no, everybody can make as much money as they possibly want to make.
It's just not always realistic.
Right. And there might not be the amount of clients to fill your books at that price realistically.
Yeah.
It just is what it is. On the other hand, I moved to LA at one point in my life, and I know others have moved to LA, and that's just an example of a big city, and had an incredibly hard time getting booked at all, no matter what the prices were.
Yeah.
Because in the bigger city, there were so many options of where they got to go. So even in LA, people didn't want to go more than 5 or 10 minutes away in order to get their services done. And that shocked me. I was expecting to move somewhere that had so many people, that had so much money, because I lived in one of the beach cities, right? And I was expecting to be able to build a clientele quickly. And it was hard. It was incredibly hard. It was easier to build a clientele in smaller town. I don't mean like smallest town, but in smaller town Minnesota than it was for me to build clientele in Los Angeles without a community, like without having grown up there and knowing people.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah. So that's really important to also take into consideration, right? That's a whole different podcast, building clientele, but
inevitably the prices were probably different going from a tiny town in Minnesota to LA.
No, I tried to charge the exact same amount.
And so what can I ask what that price was?
Yeah, I was charging about $100 to $150 for a fill and $300 for a full set. And I was booked in Minnesota, and I could barely get a single client in LA.
Interesting. So how many people, population-wise, in Minnesota, of the city that you were working in, do you know how many there were in there?
I can look it up really quick. So we just looked it up, and the city that I was doing lashes in Minnesota, the population was 61,000 the year before I moved to LA. And then the year I moved to LA, the population was over 3 million. And so I really thought, so I was in a suburb of LA technically, but I really thought that because of how many people there were there and how, naturally invested in looks LA is known to be, like, hate to say it, but it's Hollywood, right? So that was something that I really banked on. So I didn't raise my prices, but I thought that I was going to get booked so quickly. And I didn't. And that's just part of where we're at right now. So I really needed to start from the ground up to get booked. And I very likely should have lowered my prices because there were a lot of people that were doing lashes everywhere around me.
So is that roughly the same price as people in LA when you moved there? Were you like, where were you on that spectrum of prices compared to other artists in that area?
Yeah, in my area, I think I was probably a little bit on the high end. I was definitely on the high end for fills. But for full sets, I think it was probably about average. And which is crazy. Like, the average price in LA for lashes was like the highest end price in Minnesota that it could possibly be. And you know what's bonkers? I clearly don't have a full clientele anymore. I still take some clients. I haven't raised my prices in 5 years. Because I feel like, personally, this doesn't have to be a you thing, it doesn't have to be an anybody thing, but I personally feel like I don't want to price myself out and get to the point where I can barely do anybody's lashes at all. Like, if I kept raising my prices at the rate that most people are being encouraged to raise their prices these days, if it was, let's say it was $20 a full set every year, and $10 a fill every year, I would be charging almost $200 a fill and $400 for a full set. And I know that that's done. I know that that's out there, and it's just not something that I'm interested in.
Just not for you.
No.
And I think that that's something to be said too, is like, are you comfortable charging the prices that you're charging? Not in the sense of undercutting yourself, not in a self-worth way, not in a price yourself based on your worth. But for me, I have an intuitive knowing of like, I'm starting to feel uncomfortable with knowing that I can fill the spots in the future, in a year or two down the road, with the new prices that I'm implementing. When clients potentially drop off, can I still fill these spots? And when I start to feel uncomfortable in that realm, I'm like, I am actually comfortable charging what I charge right now. And that's part of the reason I didn't raise my prices last year. For the first time in my career, I have raised my prices every single year until 2023. Including 2020. I raised my prices.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was because, truthfully, I didn't feel like I wanted to. And I think that we should normalize that too. If you are happy with what you charge, you don't have to raise your prices.
However, yes, 100% agree. But there is something to be said for the fact that you cannot pretend that you understand what's going on in your clients' heads or in your clients' finances or in your clients' wallets. So you cannot put yourself in their place and then make yourself feel bad for what you charge because you have no idea what they actually value. So intuitively being at your price level that feels good to you is 100% different than trying to put yourself in your client's shoes and determining that you're not worth it because you're imagining they think you maybe aren't worth it.
Sure. There's, again, going back to what we have been taught and seeing all the time is like, price your worth. Charge your worth. But like, to me, that was confusing because I'm like, well, my worth versus my work's worth. How do I price that? To me, that was an unhelpful advice.
Yeah.
And so, yes, absolutely. Strategically, you should not price yourself based on your own budget and how you value lash extensions. You could maybe not value lash extensions, and it might not be something that you would personally invest your own money into. That doesn't mean that there aren't people out there that would, and your clients do prioritize that.
Major spoiler. Even when I could get lashes, I didn't. I didn't want to pay for them.
Yeah. And that's totally fair. That doesn't mean that you should undercut how much you charged because it was what you prioritized.
Exactly. So my clients taught me what they prioritized. I had a client get a part-time job at a coffee shop that was literally her lash fund. I had clients that forwent splurges that they normally did because they wanted their lashes instead.
Yeah.
There can always be budget found for something that we value. Absolutely. So if your clients value their lashes, which I very much believe they do, and you serve them really, really well, they will find that budget for those lashes.
So that kind of leads us into your current demand and capacity.
Yeah, and the capacity that you have to take more clients on.
Yeah, so how booked are you and how much demand are you receiving for your services?
Right. So I will fully admit that I have been the person that says, raise your prices when you're fully booked. Kind of indiscriminately. Like whenever you're fully booked again, raise your prices. I don't know that I necessarily 100% agree with that.
So are you recommending that, or did you recommend that in the sense of, because you should always have, this is how I was taught. You always raise your prices when you are fully booked because you should always have at least 20% left on your books. You should always be 80% booked, 20% remaining for new clients to always come back onto your books. That's how I was taught to raise my prices initially. So when you reach 100% capacity, the goal is to then raise your prices, work less, make the same or make more, and have less clients if those clients fall off. And then you have 20%, give or take, remaining for you to then fill more spots. That's how I was initially taught to raise my prices, with that 100% demand. Is that kind of the way that you were taught, or how you went about that?
Yes. But it was typically the people that I talked to that were running themselves ragged. It was the people who were solidly booked, working way more hours in a day than they should. And
Overbooked.
Overbooked. Anything more than 8 hours in a day is not healthy for your body as a lash artist.
Totally.
And I never even worked 8 hours a day as a lash artist. The most I worked as a lash artist was 6. Those are my own boundaries. Those are my own parameters.
Yep.
I never wanted to work more than that because my body was going to hurt, and it did. And the concept of being booked is if you are as full as you want to be, right?
Exactly.
I think so many people
Looks
go,
different
oh, well,
for
I'm
everyone.
not fully booked, but I only work 3 days a week. Well, okay. Are you fully booked on those 3 days? Oh, well, yeah. Okay. Then you're fully booked. Like we're not talking about a 40-hour work week, right? So yes, I was at the point where when I gave the advice that anytime you're fully booked, you raise your prices, it was typically to people who were like working themselves to the bone, who were overbooked, and who could not seem to get a handle on it, which, like, good for them. They are in enormous demand. But if you are in that much demand, you need to be charging more. You can be charging more, right?
So I guess by me asking you that is that I have also in the lash industry always been taught that the entire point of raising your prices is to intentionally lose clients.
I think that's bullshit.
I 100% disagree with that too.
Yeah, I don't like it at all. That's why the title of this episode is How to Raise Your Prices Without Losing Any Clients. I had boundaries. I worked as much as I wanted to work, and I did not want to lose my clients when I raised my prices. So that's why I figured out how to raise them without losing them. You might be in a different space, but I think if you need to work less, you should close the hours that you're available to your clients, and maybe eventually somebody will drop off, but typically they'll figure out how to work it in and maybe come in a little bit less frequently. And you're going to talk about that with coming in every 3 weeks instead of every 2. But you can make it work if you want to work less. You can change your hours and work less. But I don't think that that raising your prices just to get rid of people should be a great motivation. I loved my clients. Like,
That's
I
not my
wanted
goal.
to keep them, and it wasn't my goal
My
to
goal
get rid of them.
is not to gouge somebody's pocketbook in order to get rid of them on my books. To me, that did not feel like it aligned with my business values.
I agree.
So, with that being said, with the demand and the capacity, we're talking about how that does constitute a price raise. So, in what context does a certain demand and capacity constitute a price raise?
I would say if you are as booked as you're comfortable being, and you have been for a while, it might be time to raise your prices.
Yes.
If you raised your prices in the last 6 months, it's not. Be kind to your clients.
Yes.
Okay? They pay your bills. Like you said, we're not price gouging them. They literally pay our bills.
And the other thing with that little nugget right there that you just said, I just want to toss in, our entire business is not built on full sets and trying to get new clients in constantly at that high price point. Our goal is to have returning clients paying fill prices. That is what builds our business the most, is returning clients. It's not trying to constantly get new clients in.
No.
Paying your larger prices. That's a one-time full set cost for a reason.
So let's talk about how you determine what your prices are in the first place. And this is going to be pretty quick. So if you guys need a breakdown, message either me or Erin on Instagram, and we can get you more information on this. But So many people look at the people around them and base their prices on the people around them. Put your blinders on. You don't need to care about who Sally is charging down the street and how much she's charging. That doesn't matter. What matters is how much money you want to make per hour.
And your overhead.
Right. So you figure out how much you want to make per hour. You figure out what your overhead is, and then you divide it up and you let that be your pricing. Yep. So I don't think, like for me, there's no reason to want to get people in for my higher ticket item, which is a full set, when I will literally make the exact same amount of money doing fills with my repeat clients. You just have to price yourself appropriately for that.
And have discernment to know what the spectrum is in your area. Like if you are like, I want to make $500 per hour and I'm going to price myself there, you might get one client, but like, let's have discernment here.
Yeah, you might not.
Yeah. Like we're just talking about being realistic in your area here.
Yeah, and that's okay to be realistic in your area, because everybody else probably is too, you know? Okay, so it's the pricing that you are looking at increasing your rates to is definitely going to be based on inflation and expenses and average living wage. It's going to be based on your demographic and your area. It's going to be based on your current demand and capacity. If you feel like you are in a place that you are desperate to raise your prices, but you are 30% booked or 40% booked or 50% booked,